John Miller uncovered a secret buried for decades beneath an old factory, a hidden lab where dangerous experiments had been covered up. Victor Crane, a powerful tycoon, had silenced the truth to protect his wealth, betraying science and the lives it should serve. But John, guided by curiosity and the loyalty of his dog Max, exposed the hidden truth and challenged Crane's empire. Just listen to how shocking the turn of events in this drama was, and why justice ultimately prevailed. John Miller was the sort of man who lived quietly, not because he feared the world, but because he carried too much of it inside him already. Years in the Marines had taught him discipline and endurance, but also a quiet solitude. Now, in his late 40s, John lived alone with Max, a sturdy German shepherd whose loyalty went deeper than words. Their home on the outskirts of Erie, Pennsylvania, was modest, weather-worn, yet filled with the calm rhythm of two lives intertwined. One autumn afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the window, a letter arrived that broke that quiet. It came in a worn envelope with an official seal, addressed in a precise hand. The words inside carried news that would change John's life. He had inherited an old factory from his late uncle, a man John barely remembered. There was no will, no warning, just a single note in the letter. "It's yours now. Seek the truth." It was enough to spark something inside him. John wasn't a man who chased mysteries, but he knew better than to ignore one that had found him. The next morning, with Max at his side, John drove to the address. The factory sat at the far edge of town, its frame worn and silent. Rust claimed the steel, windows were fractured or gone entirely, and vines crept up the walls like silent fingers. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, catching light in ghostly streams. Broken machines rested in permanent stillness, their gears frozen by years of neglect. The place smelled of old oil, metal, and something older still, something forgotten. John stepped forward cautiously, boots crunching on debris. Max's ears twitched, his body stiffened. The dog moved ahead, sniffing and pawing at the floor, a low rumble in his throat that John recognized as warning. John shook his head. "Relax, boy. Let's just look around." But Max didn't relax. Instead, he circled the main hall of the factory again and again, his paws scratching more aggressively at one section of the wooden floor near the far wall. John knelt beside him. The wood felt strange, warmer somehow than the surrounding floorboards. He tapped it. It sounded hollow. Curiosity began to stir. He bent lower, brushing away layers of dust and splinters. Night came before John had the answer. Back at his small rented room nearby, he could think of nothing but the factory. Sleep came reluctantly, haunted by images of the dark, silent place and Max's insistence. The next night, driven by curiosity he could no longer deny, John returned. The air was colder inside the factory now, heavier. Max led the way back to the same spot, sniffing in silent urgency. Then, without warning, he dug. His paws scrabbled at the wood with quiet determination, the sound muffled under the weight of the darkness. John moved closer. The floor gave way beneath Max's persistence. There was a sudden soft crash, followed by a gap opening in the planks. Dust and air poured upward, carrying with them a scent unlike anything John had smelled before, sharp, metallic, and strangely chemical. A narrow opening appeared before them, leading into darkness. John's breath caught. Max looked up at him, his eyes fixed, alert, almost as if urging him forward. John's hand rested on the edge of the hole. The words of the letter echoed in his mind. Seek the truth. Intrigue had taken root. He knew he could not walk away. Whatever lay beneath the floorboards was no accident, and whatever it was waiting for him. That night, in silence, John made his decision. He would go in. What began as inheritance curiosity was becoming something much greater, a mystery that promised answers, danger, and perhaps the kind of truth a man could never prepare for. The opening beneath the floorboards was narrow, just wide enough for John to slip through with Max at his heels. The air that rushed upward was colder than the air above, carrying a sharp metallic scent that made John instinctively pull his jacket tighter. Max stepped carefully, his paws silent on the stone floor below. The tunnel was tight, walls of rough stone lined with pipes that hummed faintly. It twisted downward in almost complete darkness until John's hand brushed something smooth, a panel or a door. A faint click echoed when he pressed it, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the air shifted, and a faint hum began to rise around them. Dim lights flickered on, bathing the space in a pale glow. John blinked. This was no ordinary basement. Before him stretched a vast chamber that looked as though it had been sealed for decades. Machines lined the walls, tall, complex structures with blinking panels, glass cylinders filled with strange substances, and screens that glowed with unreadable codes. The air was cool and metallic, carrying the scent of chemicals and something else, something John couldn't name. Shelves along one wall were stacked with glass vials, each sealed and labeled with strange symbols. Notebooks lay scattered across tables, their pages covered in handwriting that twisted into unfamiliar shapes. John picked one up, turning the pages slowly. The script was not English, but certain words were marked in bold, as if for emphasis. Project Helios, Metamorphosis, Containment Protocol. John's pulse quickened. This was not the work of a hobbyist. This was something far more elaborate and deeply secret. His eyes scanned further. There, pinned to a corkboard above a desk, were photographs. They showed a younger version of his uncle standing beside men and women in lab coats, their faces stern, focused. In some photos, there were machines that looked impossibly advanced for their time. Others showed figures, human subjects, connected to equipment in ways that looked experimental, even unsettling. One photograph in particular froze John's breath. His uncle stood beside a group of scientists, pointing at a glowing apparatus, while a figure in the background lay motionless on a table. The expression on his uncle's face was one of pride, but the scene radiated unease. On a nearby desk lay a file marked in bold letters, Project Helios. John pulled it open. Inside were documents that read like the work of an advanced laboratory far beyond ordinary science, descriptions of trials, schematics for devices designed to alter human biology, and encrypted logs. The words made John's stomach tighten. This was not an abandoned workshop. It was the remains of a project buried in secrecy, a project his uncle had clearly been part of. His mind raced. Who had built this lab? Why was it hidden beneath an old factory in Erie? And why had his uncle been involved? Every question seemed to open another deeper, darker one. John glanced at Max, who sat alert, ears forward, growling softly. The dog's instinct told him something John could not yet articulate. They were not alone. Somewhere beyond the faint hum of the machines, behind the veil of silence, something, or someone, was watching. John stepped deeper into the lab, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor. He ran a hand along a control panel and saw schematics flash across a screen, blueprints for something labeled Phase X. His head spun with the implications. This wasn't just a secret laboratory. It was part of something larger, something deliberately hidden. A sudden noise, the creak of metal, made John freeze. He held his breath. Max's hackles rose. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the lab, a faint sound moved toward them, deliberate, slow, and almost human. John's heart pounded. The shock of what he had found was eclipsed by the realization that uncovering this secret was not without danger. Someone had buried this place for a reason, and now John had walked right into it. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there was no turning back. For days, John returned to the lab. Each visit peeled back another layer of secrecy, and with every page of the journals, every schematic, every photograph, the sense of outrage inside him grew. What had begun as curiosity was now something far heavier, a sense of betrayal. John spent hours cross-referencing the names in the lab files. One name kept appearing: Victor Crane. A local business tycoon with deep influence in Erie, Crane was known in public as a philanthropist, but the deeper John dug, the darker the picture became. Documents, old purchase records, and even newspaper clippings pointed to Crane having acquired the factory decades ago under a veil of secrecy. The reason? To bury evidence of dangerous experiments that had been carried out under the factory's floors. John felt the first real sting of anger. These weren't forgotten mistakes. They were deliberate actions hidden to protect Crane's own interests. The files described experiments that skirted every ethical boundary. Lives had been put at risk. People had been experimented on. And it had been done in silence, with no accountability. It wasn't just science hidden underground. It was corruption, exploitation, and greed. That afternoon, John decided to confront Crane directly. He found the man at an upscale office in the center of Erie, framed by polished wood and glass walls. Crane was older now, with a sharp look in his eyes and a reputation for shutting down dissent. When John mentioned the lab, Crane's face hardened. His voice was calm but cold. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Crane said. "Some things are better left buried." John shook his head. "That's exactly why I'm here. You buried it, and you're going to answer for it." Crane's smile vanished. He leaned forward, his tone dropping low. "You should walk away, Miller. Forget what you saw." It's not worth the trouble. John left that office with more than conviction. He left with fury. He had uncovered something far bigger than a forgotten lab. This was deliberate cover-up, and Crane was still protecting it. Back at the factory, John noticed changes. The air felt heavier. Shadows seemed to shift. Max growled low when they entered the building, his body tense. John knew they were being watched. Later, he saw it. A black SUV parked near the gates. Men in plain clothes moved with deliberate precision, keeping their distance but always observing. They weren't going to stop him by accident. They were trying to scare him away. But John wasn't afraid. His anger had sharpened into resolve. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. This was about justice. He wasn't going to let this go. Not for himself. Not for the truth. With Max at his side, John began a quiet campaign. Every visit to the lab became an investigation. He took photographs of the equipment, scanned pages of the journals, and recorded everything he could find. His phone became a catalog of proof, evidence of experiments, documentation linking Crane to Project Helios, and photographs that spoke louder than words. The deeper John worked, the more it became clear this was no private battle. The factory, the hidden lab, Crane's cover-up, it had become something bigger, something dangerous. Whispers began to spread through the town. Some locals warned John to leave it alone. Others began to ask questions quietly. An invisible war was forming, one between silence and exposure, and John had stepped into the center of it. He felt the anger inside him like fire. Every moment he spent in that lab, every scrap of truth he uncovered, strengthened his determination. He wasn't just fighting for answers anymore. He was fighting for justice, and he would not stop. The morning John decided to go public with the truth was crisp and clear. Erie seemed quieter somehow, as if holding its breath. He sat in his small living room, surrounded by folders, photographs, and documents, every piece of evidence he had gathered over weeks. His phone was set to record a message he knew would change everything. He spoke calmly, but with conviction, explaining what he had found in the old factory. He told of the hidden laboratory, of Project Helios, of experiments that had been buried for decades. He named Victor Crane and explained the chain of corruption that had kept the truth locked underground. Every word carried weight, because John spoke not as a fighter or a whistleblower, but as a man who had seen injustice and refused to stay silent. By evening, the story was everywhere. Local news picked it up. Social media lit up. The name Victor Crane became a headline across Erie. Questions poured in from journalists, residents, and strangers alike. Authorities moved fast. The factory was sealed. Forensic teams and investigators descended on the site. Crane was taken into custody, his offices searched, his ties to the experiments confirmed. The weight of decades of secrecy began to crumble under the light of truth. The town shifted. A wave of shock passed through Erie as people learned of what had been buried beneath their feet for years. There was anger, yes, but there was also relief. The shadow that had hung over the factory for so long was finally lifted. The mystery was solved. John watched it all unfold from a distance, letting the noise of the world fade around him. In the days that followed, the public attention began to settle. But for John, there was something deeper than the victory of exposure. There was peace. He returned to the factory once more. The gates were closed now, guarded, but the yard was still open enough for him to stand outside. Max sat beside him, head tilted slightly, watching the scene unfold. The air here felt different, lighter, freer. The heavy scent of rust and dust had been replaced by something cleaner, almost like closure itself. John thought about his uncle. For years, the factory had been a secret buried under layers of silence. John had inherited it without knowing what it truly held. Now, by revealing the truth, he had honored whatever part of his uncle's legacy remained. It was not fame he sought, nor reward. It was justice, and that justice had been given. The town of Erie would never look at that factory the same way again. To some, it was a cautionary tale. To others, a story of courage. But to John, it was a chapter closed. He crouched beside Max, placing a hand on his loyal companion's head. "We did it, boy," he said softly. Max looked up at him with steady eyes, as if he understood every word. John stood and gazed at the factory one last time. Its walls, worn and scarred, now seemed almost alive with history. The hidden lab, the decades of secrecy, the danger buried beneath. It was over. The mystery had been solved. He turned away. There was no triumph in his step, no celebration. There was something quieter, a sense of balance restored. The anger that had driven him here was replaced by relief. As John walked away with Max at his side, the wind carried the scent of autumn across the yard. Somewhere in the town, news vans packed up and moved on, but John knew the truth he uncovered would stay with Erie forever. For him, the journey was over. The intrigue that had begun with a letter and a dog's instinct had ended with the uncovering of truth and the restoration of justice. The veteran and his dog had changed the story of their town, and now they could rest.